Hey, howdy out there. Welcome back to the Chop Shop. I am your host, Blip Blop. When we left off in the Grapes of Wrath, Jim Casey and Tom Joad had just come from the old Joad homestead after spending the night out there in the riverbank and getting to meet Muley Graves, right? So they had made their way over to Uncle John's house, where apparently all the Joads are, where they're staying prior to them going to California. We walked up on Pa, and Pa didn't even really recognize Tom. Wasn't expecting him there and then, right? And then Pa asked us, did you break out? Did you break out? Do you need to hide? And it was Paul's idea that he was going to have Jim Casey and Tommy Joe sneak up on Mom. They're going to play a little trick on her and act like these are just a couple of strangers looking for some food. And they did step in. Ma hasn't really turned and looked to see who's there yet. But interestingly enough, even though they're strangers, she says, yeah, bring them in. We'll feed them. So I'm at the top of page 95. Here we are. Pa stepped inside, clearing the door, and Tom looked in at his mother. She was lifting the curdling slices of pork from the frying pan. The oven door was open, and a great pan of 5 brown biscuits stood waiting there. She looked out of the door, but she saw only a dark figure outlined by a bright yellow sunlight. She nodded pleasantly. Come in, she said. It was lucky I made plenty of bread this morning. Tom stood looking in, and Ma was heavy, but not fat, thick with childbearing and work. She wore a loose Mother Hubbard of gray cloth, in which there had once been colored flowers, but the color was washed out now, so that the small flowered pattern was only a little lighter gray than the background. The dress came down to her ankles, and her strong, broad, bare feet moved quickly and deftly over the floor. Her thin steel gray hair was gathered in a sparse wispy knot at the back of her head. Strong freckled arms were bare to the elbow, and her hands were chubby and delicate like those of a plump little girl. She looked out into the sunshine. Her full face was not soft. It was controlled, kindly. Her hazel eyes seemed to have experienced all possible tragedy and to have mounted pain and suffering like steps into a high calm and a superhuman understanding. She seemed to know, to accept, to welcome her position, the citadel of the family, the strong place that could not be taken. And since old Tom and the children could not know hurt or fear unless she acknowledged hurt and fear, she had practiced denying them in herself. And since when a joyful thing happened, they looked to see whether joy was on her, it was her habit to build up laughter out of inadequate materials. But better than joy was calm, imperturbably could be depended upon. And from her great and humble position in the family, she had taken dignity in a clean, calm beauty. From her position as healer, her hands had grown sure and cool and quiet. From her position as arbiter, she had become as remote and faultless in judgment as a goddess. She seemed to know that if she swayed, the family shook. And if she ever really deeply wavered or despaired, the family would fall. The family will to function would be gone. Wow, Mom. Quite the lady. I mean, besides the chicken part earlier, she apparently is the rock of the family. She is the people that keeps. She's the person that keeps this family on the straight and narrow, right? So, Macho, I know. She looked out into the sunny yard at the dark figure of a man. Pot stood nearby, shaking with excitement. Come in, he cried. Come right in, mister. And Tom, a little shamefaced, as they stepped over the doorsill. She looked up pleasantly from the frying pan, and then her hand sank slowly to her side, and the fork clattered to the wooden floor. Her eyes opened wide, and the pupils dilated. She breathed heavily through her open mouth. She closed her eyes. Thank God, she said. Oh, thank God. And suddenly her face was worried. Tommy, you ain't wanted. You didn't bust loose. No, Ma. Parole. I got my papers here. He touched his breast. She moved toward him lithely, soundlessly in her bare feet, and her face was full of wonder. Her small hand felt his arm, felt the soundness of his muscles, and then her fingers went up to his cheek as a blind man's fingers might. And her joy was nearly like sorrow. Tom pulled up his underlip between his teeth and bit it. Her eyes went wonderingly to his bitten lip, and she saw a little line of blood against his teeth and the trickle of blood down his lip. Then she knew. and her control came back and her hand dropped. Her breath came out explosively. Well, she cried, we come mighty near to going on without you. And we was wondering how in the world you would ever find us. She picked up the fork, combed the boiling grease, and brought out a dark curl of crisp pork, and she set the pot of tumbling coffee on the back of the stove. So Ma was relieved to see Tommy. She was really worried that once they left for California, how do you track the guy down? But one thing we really haven't addressed too much, or at least Ma hasn't addressed in pause, Tommy's parole. How was he supposed to get out of town? I think one thing you'll see as we go forward is the close-knit relationship between Tommy and his mother. Keep a spare eye on that. There we go. Oh, she also thought that he broke out of prison. Kind of funny. Old Tom giggled. Fooled ya, Ma? Huh, Ma? We aimed to fool you and we done it. Just stood there like a hammered sheep. Wish Grandpa had been there to see it. Looked like somebody beat you between the eyes with a sledge. Grandpa would have whacked himself so hard, he'd have thrown his hip out. Like he done when he's seen Al take a shot at that great big airship the Army got. Tommy had come over one day, half a mile big, and Al, he gets to 30-30 and blazes away at her. Grandpa yells, don't shoot no fledglings, Al. Wait till a grown-up one goes over, and then he whacked himself and threw his hip out. I like this family. So Al, one of Pa and Ma's kids, sees a dirigible or a Zeppelin, big airship going over, takes out the rifle, starts unloading it, and Grandpa says, hey, throw that one back, man. Gotta wait till they get big. The thing was massive. Grandpa laughed so hard he hurt himself. Ma chuckled and took down the heap of tin plates from a shelf. Tom asked, where is Grandpa? I ain't seen the old devil. Ma stacked the plates on the kitchen table and piled cups beside them. She said confidentially, oh, him and Grandma sleeps in the barn. They got to get up so much in the night, they was stumbling over the little fellows. Pa broke in. Yeah, every night Grandpa would get mad. Tumble over Winfield, and Winfield would yell, and Grandpa would get mad and wet his drawers, and that'd make him madder, and pretty soon everybody in the house would be yelling their heads off. His words tumbled out between his chuckles. So we had lively times. But one night when everybody was yelling and cussing, your brother Al, he's a smart Al now. He says, God damn it, Grandpa, why don't you run off and be a pirate? Well, that made Grandpa so goddamn mad, he went for his gun. I had to sleep out in the field that night. But now Grandma and Grandpa both sleeps in the barn. Ma said, they can just get up and step outside when they feel like it. Pa, run out and tell them Thomas home. Grandpa's a favorite of them. Of course, said Pa. I should have did it before. And he went out the door and crossed the yard, swinging his hands high. Tom watched him go, and then his mother's voice called his attention. She was pouring coffee. She did not look at him. Tommy, she said hesitantly, timidly. Yeah, he said. His timidity was set off by hers, a curious embarrassment. Each one knew the other was shy, and became more shy in the knowledge. Tommy, I got to ask you, you ain't mad? Mad, Mom? He ain't poison mad. You don't hate nobody. They didn't do nothing in that jail to rot you out with crazy mad. Okay, so Mom's asking, are you crazy? Did your experiences in prison drive you crazy? See what Tommy has to say. He looked sideways at her and studied her, and his eyes seemed to ask how she could know such things. No, he said, I was for a little while. But I ain't proud like some fellas. Now let the stuff run off of me. What's the matter, Ma? Now she was looking at him, her mouth open as though to hear better, her eyes digging to know better. Her face looked for the answer that it is always concealed in language. She said in confusion, I know pretty boy Floyd. I know his Ma. They was good folks. He was full of hell, sure, like a good boy ought to be. She paused, and then her words poured out. I don't know all like this, but I know it. He done a little bad thing, and they hurt him, and they caught him, and they hurt him. So he was mad, and the next bad thing he done was mad, and then they hurt him again, and pretty soon he was mean mad, and they shot him like a varmint, and he shot back, and then they run him like a coyote, and he was a snapping and a snarling mean as a lobo, and he was mad, and he wasn't a boy or no man no more. He was just a walking chunk of mean man. But the folks that knowed him didn't hurt him. He wasn't mad at them. Finally, they run him down and they killed him. No matter how they say it was in the paper, how he was bad, that's how it was. She paused and she licked her dry lips, and her whole face was an aching question. I gotta know, Tommy, did they hurt you so much? Did they make you mad like that? Pretty Boy Floyd is a real character. In fact, I've talked to you a little bit about Woody Guthrie. Woody Guthrie is the Depression era folk singer. He wrote real songs about Pretty Boy Floyd. Pretty Boy Floyd was kind of like America's answer to Robin Hood. He was a real guy who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. So this is a reference to a real Oklahoma story that Moss talking about. She said they drove that Pretty Boy Floyd crazy. They didn't do the same thing to Hugh, did they, Tommy? Tom's heavy lips were pulled tight over his teeth. He looked down at his big flat hands. Ah, he said, yeah, I ain't like that. He paused and studied the broken nails, which were rigid like clamshells. All the time in the stir, I kept away from stuff like that. I ain't so mad, she sighed. Thank God, under her breath. He looked up quickly. Ma, when I see what they done to our house, she came near to him now and stood close, and she said passionately, Tommy, don't you go fighting them alone. They'll hunt you down like a coyote. Tommy, I got to thinking and dreaming and wondering. They say there's 100,000 of us pushed out. If we was all mad the same way, Tommy, they wouldn't hunt nobody down. She stopped. Tommy looked at her, looking at her, gradually drooped his eyelids until just a short glitter showed through his lashes. Any folks feel that way? He demanded. I don't know. They're just kind of stunned, walking around like they was half asleep. From outside and across the yard came an ancient creaking bleat. Praise God for victory! Praise God for victory! Tommy turned his head and grinned. Grandma finally heard him all. Hey, Ma, he said, you never was like this before. Her face hardened and her eyes grew cold. I never had my house pushed over. I never had my family struck out on the road. I never had to sell everything. Here they come now. She moved back to the stove and dumped the big pan of Bubba's biscuits onto 2 tin plates. She shook flour into the deep grease to make gravy, and her hand was white with flour. For a moment, Tom watched her, and then he went to the door. Across the yard came 4 people. Grandpa was ahead, a lean, ragged, quick old man, jumping with quick steps and favoring his right leg, the side that came out of joint. He was buttoning his fly as he came, and his old hands were having trouble finding the buttons, for he had buttoned the top button into the second buttonhole, and that threw the whole sequence off. He wore dark, ragged pants and a torn blue shirt open all the way down and showing long gray underwear also unbuttoned. His lean white chest, fuzzed with white hair, was visible through the opening in his underwear. He gave up the fly and left it open and fumbled with his underwear buttons. Then he gave up the whole thing and hitched his brown suspenders. He was a lean, excitable face with little bright eyes, as evil as a frantic child's eyes. A cantankerous, complaining, mischievous, laughing face. He fought and argued, told dirty stories. He was as lecherous as always, vicious and cruel and impatient like a frantic child, and the whole structure overlaid with amusement. He drank too much when he could get it, ate too much when it was there, and talked too much all the time. You meet an old guy like Grandpa before? Great talker, great storyteller, completely inappropriate. They're nice guys to have around. Sure are entertaining. Behind them gobbled Grandma, who had survived only because she was as mean as her husband. She had held her own with a shrill, ferocious religiosity that was as lecherous and as savage as anything Grandpa could offer. Once after a meeting, while she was still speaking in tongues, she fired both barrels of a shotgun at her husband, ripping one of his buttocks nearly off. And after that, he admired her and did not try to torture her as children torture bugs. As she walked, she hiked her Mother Hubbard up to her knees, and she bleated her shrill, terrible war cry, "Praise God for victory!" So as inappropriate as Grandpa is as religious as Grandma is. And the only reason they survive each other is because they're both as extreme. Grandpa and Grandpa raced each other to get across the broad yard. They fought over everything and loved and needed the fighting. You ever meet a couple like that? A couple that seems to need fights in order to survive. Behind them, moving slowly and evenly, but keeping up, came Pa and Noah. Noah, the firstborn, tall and strange, walking always with a wondering look on his face, calm and puzzled. He had never been angry in his life. He looked in wonder at angry people, wonder and uneasiness as normal people look at the insane. Noah moved slowly, spoke seldom, and then so slowly that people who did not know him often thought him stupid. He was not stupid, but he was strange. He had little pride, no sexual urges. He worked and slept in a curious rhythm that nevertheless sufficed him. He was fond of his folks, but never showed it in any way. Although an observer could not have told why, Noah left the impression of being misshapen. His head or his body or his legs or his mind, but no misshapen member could be recalled. Pa thought he knew why Noah was strange, but Pa was ashamed and never told. For on the night when Noah was born, Pa, frightened at the spreading thighs, alone in the house and horrified at the screaming wretch his wife had become, went mad with apprehension. Using his hands, his strong fingers for forceps, he had pulled and twisted the baby. The midwife, arriving late, had found the baby's head pulled out of shape, its neck stretched, its body warped, and she had pushed the head back and molded the body with her hands. But Pa always remembered and was ashamed. And he was kinder to Noah than to the others. In Noah's broad face, eyes too far apart, and long, fragile jaw, Pa thought he saw the twisted, warped skull of the baby. Noah could do all that was required of him, could read and write, could work and figure, but he didn't seem to care. There was a listlessness in him toward things people wanted and needed. He lived in a strange, silent house and looked out of it through calm eyes. He was a stranger to all the world, but he was not lonely. Dang. Okay, so that's the oldest Joad kid, Noah Joad. And something seemed to be off about Noah, and Pa's pretty sure it has to do with him being born. Apparently, on the night he was born, there's Pa alone in a shack in Oklahoma, and Ma, his wife, screaming, and he just panicked and grabbed Noah and may have done some harm in the instance. So apparently, he never gets mad, never has pride, never has sexual urges. Noah, Tom's older brother. The four came across the yard and Grandpa demanded, "Where is he? God damn it, where is he?" And his fingers fumbled for his pants button and forgotten straight into his pocket. And then he saw Tom standing in the door. Grandpa stopped and he stopped the others. His little eyes glittered with malice. Look at him. He said, "A jailbird. Ain't been no Joes in jail for a hell of a long time." His mind jumped. Got no right to put him in jail. He done just what I do. Sons of bitches got no right. His mind jumped again. An old Turnbull, stinking skunk, bragging how he'll shoot you when you come out. Says he got Hatfield blood. Well, I sent word to him. I said, "Don't mess around with no Jud. Maybe I got McCoy blood for all I know." I says, "You lay your sights anywhere near Tommy, and I'll take it and I'll ram it up your ass." I says, scared him too. Oh, Grandpa. He thinks that I'll get to it. Grandma, not following the conversation, bleated, "Praise God for victory." Grandpa walked up and slapped Tom on the chest, and his eyes grinned with affection and pride. "How are you, Tommy?" "Okay," said Tom. "How you keeping yourself?" "Full of piss and vinegar," said Grandpa. His mind jumped. "Just like I said, there ain't gonna keep no Joe in jail." I says, "Tommy will come busting out of that jail like a bull through a corral fence." And you done it. "Get out of my way, I'm hungry." So Grandpa thinks he busted out too. That's Pa, Ma, Grandpa. "Get out of my way, I'm hungry." He crowded past and sat down and loaded his plate with pork and 2 big biscuits and poured the thick gravy over the whole mess. And before the others could get in, Grandpa's mouth was full. Tom grinned at him affectionately at him. "Ain't he a heller?" he said. And Grandpa's mouth was so full he couldn't even sputter, but his mean little eyes smiled and he nodded his head violently. Grandma said proudly, "A wickeder, cussier man never lived. He's gone to hell on a poker, praise God. Wants to drive the truck," she said spitefully. "Well, he ain't gonna." Grandpa choked and a mouthful of paste sprayed into his lap and he coughed weakly. Grandma smiled up at Tom. "Messy, ain't he?" she observed brightly. Noah stood up on the step and he faced Tom, and his wide set eyes seemed to look around him. His face had little expression. Tom said, "How you, Noah?" "Fine," said Noah. "How you?" That was all, but it was a comfortable thing. It's kind of funny after all these years, 4 years of not seeing each other, Noah and Tom's interaction are, "How you, Noah?" "Fine. How you?" No, I ain't got much to say, son. Ma waved the flies away from the bowl of gravy. "We ain't got room to sit down," she said. "Just get yourself a plate and sit down wherever you can, out in the yard or someplace." Suddenly, Tom said, "Hey, where'd the preacher go? He was right here. Where'd he go?" I said, "I seen him, but he's gone." And Grandma's raised a shrill voice, "Preacher, you gotta preach. Go get him. We'll have grace." She pointed at Grandpa. "Too late for him. He's 8. Go get the preacher." And Tom stepped out on the porch. "Hey, Jim Casey," he called. He walked out and into the yard. "Oh, Casey." The preacher emerged from under the tank and sat up, then stood up and moved toward the house. Tom asked, "What are you doing? Hiding?" No, but a fella shouldn't butt his head in where a family got family stuff. I was just sitting there thinking." "Well, come on in and eat," said Tom. Grandma wants grace, but I ain't a preacher no more," Casey protested. "Come on, give her grace. Don't do you no harm, and she likes him." They walked into the kitchen together. Ma said quietly, "You're welcome." Pa said, "You're welcome. Have some breakfast." "Grace first," Grandma clamored in. "Grace first." Grandpa focused his eyes fiercely until he recognized Casey. "Oh, that preacher," he said. "Oh, he's all right. I always liked him since I seen him." He winked so lecherously that Grandma thought he had spoken and retorted, "Shut up, you sinful old goat." Casey ran his fingers through his hair nervously. "I got to tell you, I ain't a preacher no more. If me just being here, just being glad to be here, being thankful for people, that's kind and generous. If that's enough, why, I'll say some kind of grace, but I ain't a preacher no more." "There," said Grandma, "and get in a word about us going to California." The preacher bowed his head and the others bowed their heads. Ma folded her hands over her stomach and bowed her head. Grandma bowed so low that her nose was nearly in her plate of biscuit and gravy. Tom, leaning against the wall, a plate in his hand, bowed stiffly, and Grandpa bowed his head sideways so they could keep one mean and merry eye on the preacher. And on the preacher's face, there was not a look of prayer, but of thought, and in his tone, not supplication, but conjecture. "I've been thinking," he said. "I've been in the hills thinking, almost you might say like Jesus went out into the wilderness to think his way out of a mess of troubles." That's an interesting connection. Seems like a guy named Jesus too went off in the wilderness to deal with his questions of faith and hammer out some inconsistencies in his mind, just like Jim Casey did. Keep an eye on that. "Praise God," Grandma said, and the preacher glanced over at her in surprise. "And it seems like Jesus got all messed up with troubles and he couldn't figure nothing out. And he got the feeling, what the hell good is it all? And what's the use of fighting and figuring? Got tired, got good and tired, and his spirit all wore out. Just about come to the conclusion, to hell with it. And so he went off in the wilderness." "Amen," Grandma bleated. So many years she had timed her responses, the pauses, and it was so many years since she had listened or wondered at any of the words. Well, I ain't saying I'm like Jesus, preacher or not, but I got tired like him, and I got mixed up like him, and I went out into the wilderness like him without no camping stuff. Nighttime, I'd lay on my back and look up at the stars. Morning, I'd sit and watch the sun come up. Midday, I'd look out from the hill at the rolling dry country. Even I'd follow the sun down. Sometimes I'd pray like I always done, only I couldn't figure out what I was praying to or for. There was the hills and there was me, and we wasn't separate no more. We was one thing, and that one thing was holy. So one of the things that Jim Casey got when he was off on his spiritual quest, trying to figure out where he was in comparison with his religion, is out in nature. And one of the things that he found out in nature, that he was connected to the earth, that he was laying in, connected to the earth that he was laying on, that he was viewing, that he was integrated into the earth. And that reflects on John Steinbeck's use of naturalism as well, doesn't it? Well, that's all I have for you today. Stay tuned on Monday, and there will be another video. Deep game. Thanks, folks.